European superpowers ruled and dominated African countries for many years in what is popularly referred to as the colonial rule. The foreign rulers benefited significantly from resources found in African countries between the years 1800 and 1960s. The colonizers obtained raw materials for their manufacturing industries and later shipped back the finished products into Africa and later sold them to Africans as the end consumers. However, it did not take long before the native citizens of the African countries got tired of this trend and the struggle for independence began in many countries. In this video, we are going to highlight each African country and the year it got its independence to govern itself. There are those African countries that were never colonized. These include Ethiopia and Liberia. Ethiopia experienced a brief invasion by the Italians. However, it gained back full control in the year 1896 after battling with the Italians. The Ethiopians, under the leadership of the Emperor Haile Selassie, defeated the Italians and won their early independence, which is attributed to their unity as a people. Ethiopia is considered as never colonized because the Italian invasion in Ethiopia did not last long enough for it to be considered as colonization. Liberia is the second country from Africa that is considered to have not been colonized. However, it is reported that there was a short period of foreign control from the United States of America in the Liberian territory, and reputable sources cite that Liberia gained back its independence in the year 1847. The two nations, Ethiopia and Liberia, were not affected by the scramble for Africa by the European powers, which took place between the years 1881 and 1914. All the other African countries, apart from Ethiopia and Liberia, were colonized and they fought for their independence. By the year 1922, the struggle for independence for the African countries began to show some success as Egypt won its independence. Approximately 3 decades later, in the year 1951, Libya also succeeded in gaining its freedom from the Italian colonial administration. 5 years later, in the year 1956, 3 more countries gained their independence, which includes Morocco, Sudan, and Tunisia. Both Morocco and Tunisia were ruled by France, while Sudan was under the Great Britain colonial rule. 1 year later, in 1957, it was Ghana's turn to celebrate independence from the British colonial government. It was then followed by Guinea, which gained full control of the country's operations in the year 1958. 2 years later, in 1960, 17 more African countries became free from European control. These include Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, Congo-Brazzaville, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, Madagascar, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Somalia, and Togo. 1 year later, in 1961, 2 more African countries gained their freedom, which included Sierra Leone and Tanzania. In the year 1962, the fight for independence finally became successful in Algeria, Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda, which enabled the 4 countries to form democratic governments under black leadership. 1 year later, in 1963, Kenya also gained its independence from the British colonial masters. In 1964, Malawi and Zambia secured their independence and became free from the British colonial rule. Later in 1965, Gambia also gained its freedom from the British colonial government. 1 year later, in 1966, Botswana and the Kingdom of Lesotho became democratic republics under the leadership of their native citizens. 2 years later, in 1968, the Equatorial Guinea, Mauritius, and the Kingdom of Swaziland also became free from the colonial masters. In 1974, Guinea-Bissau also obtained its independence, and in the following year, 1975, Angola, Cape Verde, Comoros, Mozambique, Sao Tome and Principe also became free from colonial administration. 1 year later, in 1976, the Sahrawi Arabic Democratic Republic and Seychelles also got full control of their country affairs. In 1977, Djibouti became independent, and later in 1980, Zimbabwe gained its freedom. A decade later, in 1990, Namibia finally gained control of its internal affairs. South Africa followed 4 years later in 1994. The country had gained self-governance status in the year 1931. However, apartheid began soon thereafter, which was perpetrated by the Dutch and the British. Apartheid was characterized by racial discrimination. South Africa became a republic in the year 1961. Apartheid later ended in the year 1994, and thereafter the leadership was handed over to South African native citizens, with Nelson Mandela becoming the first black president of the Republic of South Africa. The last nation to gain its independence was South Sudan in the year 2011. However, it should be noted that South Sudan claimed its independence from Sudan. The European colonizers left Sudan in the year 1956, but later civil war began in Sudan, which led to South Sudan breaking away from the nation, citing marginalization from the Sudanese government. South Sudan finally became independent in the year 2011. Overall, the colonial rule from the European powers robbed African countries their independence, freedom, and their resources. The exploitation that took place during the colonial era contributed significantly to the current situation in some of the countries where a significant number of citizens live below the poverty line. Furthermore, some of the European powers still influence African countries that have rich reserves of minerals due to their interest in exploiting the resources for their own selfish gains at the expense of the native Africans. This is an illustration that although the colonial rule ended in all African countries, it still exists indirectly since a majority of the current leaderships in African countries is influenced by external powers. This denies Africans the privilege of enjoying their freedom and the resources that come from their motherland, Africa.